Yesterday, we walked through some of the development of the fourth commandment, which says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. We were focusing on the Old Testament. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the fourth commandment as we see it developed after that. So initially, we have the intertestamental period. There's 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. And during those 400 years, you have a number of moving parts. Initially, the Greeks defeat the Persians. You're gonna have at the end of it, the Romans are going to come on strong. But while all that's happening, the Jewish religious leaders, and in particular the Pharisees, who the Jews sort of divide up as the New Testament is starting. They're sort of dividing into four camps. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes, based on how they're trying to understand what God is doing and how they should interact with Rome. But the Pharisees really develop a lot of rules about the Sabbath. And the argument, I mean, let's give credit where credit is due. They say this is a big, fat, hairy deal. You don't want to violate it. Consequently, it's as if the speed limit says don't go 30 miles an hour, we're going to say don't go 20 miles an hour so that you're at no risk of ever going 30 miles an hour. So they build all these buffers around the actual fourth commandment, and they end up with all these rules. They break work into 39 different categories. And they have all these elaborate rules about what you can do and what you can't do. And so, for instance, they say tying a knot is work, so you can't tie knots. Well, in a world before buttons and zippers, saying you can't tie knots means you can't keep your clothes on. And so they go, okay, you can tie knots, but you can only tie a knot that you can untie with one hand. And then they have rules about whether or not a man who has a wooden leg can carry the wooden leg out of his house if his house is on fire. And rules about whether or not you can help an old person who has fallen down and can't get up. And they decide, by the way, that the answer is no, unless you think they're going to die during the course of the day. Then you could help them up. So, okay, look, you sort of see this Houston, we have a problem. This becomes a huge exercise in missing the point. And so Jesus will really, the scuffles that Jesus has with the Pharisees really fall into two categories. One is the small matter that he claims to be God, which, makes them apoplectic. But secondly, it's all these rules that they have about the Sabbath. And he's not going there. And so while he doesn't ever break the fourth commandment, he breaks their rules around the fourth commandment. He will go to the synagogue on the Sabbath and he will say he's Lord of the Sabbath. But he says, we've got this backwards. The Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Man isn't all about just, making the Sabbath the most important thing. The Sabbath was set up for man. It's a gift. It's an opportunity to recover, to catch your breath, to be realigned. So you have all those changes that are taking place, intertestamental period and then with Jesus. And then there have been other changes that have taken place since then. So it used to be, you go back 100 years ago, people talked about having the holy Sabbath, right? The Sabbath is holy, we got to keep it holy. And then they started just talking about the Sabbath. And then you start to see people, and the Sabbath was still thought of as this time of, worship and restoration of your heart and your soul. And then at some point, the Sabbath stops being called the Sabbath and it starts being called Sunday. And Sundays are a little bit more time for amusement. And, I don't know, you watch football. You don't work on the Sunday, but it's not like you are being restored in that Sabbath kind of set. And then, I don't know, 20 years ago, we moved away from the idea of a Sunday. We started talking about weekends, and weekends were made for catching up. And so, now weekends, we made this Faustian bargain, right? We go, oh, I'm going to catch up. Well, now, of course, the big complaint is we can't catch up, and life is going so fast. And I have part of the reason I have such a thick folder about about articles about the Sabbath is because you now have all these secular publications, right? Wall Street Journal, Fortune Magazine, Harvard Business Review, Atlantic. I mean, all these publications talking about the value of, they don't call it a Sabbath, but in essence, they call it a Sabbath. And they talk about the need for downtime and the need for boundaries and the need for reflection and the need for meditation. And you go, right. Actually, I read about that someplace else, like from 3,500 years ago. But anyway, enough of that. The Sabbath is a gift from God to you, and you want to understand that. Have a good day.